Welcome to the Media Roundtable Special Edition, a show where we dive into the secrets of the craft of audio advertising and where we seek to provide our perspective on industry topics in service of marketers responsible for the success of their audio program, the Chief Audio Officer. I'm your host, Stu Redwine, VP of Creative Services at Oxford Road, and today I'm joined by some top-notch CAOs and Oxford Road's finest. From Oxford Road, we have Dan Granger, CEO and founder.
Thanks for having me, Stu. I appreciate it.
Always. And we've got James Ingrassia, EVP Client Services at Oxford Road.
Hello, glad to be back.
Glad to have you back. And we are very lucky, blessed in fact, to be joined by two well-accomplished CAOs who were with us at the CAO Messaging Forum last week in New York. We've got Cassandra LaPrairie, Performance Marketing Lead Audio at Wise. Welcome, Cassandra.
Thank you so much. Happy to be back with you all.
Likewise. And Nikhil Arora, Chief Growth Officer at Albert. Welcome, sir.
Hello. Happy to be here.
We're happy to have you. We've got the band back together again for the first time. So welcome to the show, everyone. And here's a little preview of the discussion. We're going to have a quick recap of Oxford Road's time at the 2024 IAB Upfront, brought to you by Dan Granger. And then we're going to give you a full rundown of the Chief Audio Officer Messaging Forum that took place last Wednesday at iHeartMedia's New York office, where we discussed topics like sonic branding, message design, getting the most from your host, and a bonus topic that everybody really got into, A/B testing. So let's get straight into the discussion. Topic number one, 2024 IAB Upfront recap. Dan, what was going on over there?
Many things were going on. I'm really only going to touch on two of them because a lot of it, I think, was your standard fare of networks talking about all the great shows that they've got coming out and how they authentically connect with their listeners. One of the things that I think was that kind of corresponded with the event was the release of information, kind of taking the wind out of a lot of people's sails, because the industry's revenue is not quite as high and no longer projected to be as high as it was previously reported. I know that there are a lot of different groups that were saying last year we broke $2 billion in revenue in podcasts alone. We thought that was true based on all the data that had been released so far. They're saying we didn't quite get there yet. And there were people suggesting that in 2024, we were going to be at $3 or $4 billion in revenue, not going to get close to that from the projections we're getting. I mean, I was talking to one of our friends that's a journalist following the podcast beat today, and she was saying, like, who's validating this? How do we even know that these numbers are accurate? Like, is Spotify really sharing this data before they report it? So I don't know. I would take it with a grain of salt, but I will say that I think there's been a lot of hype about the pace of the growth in the industry. And I think a lot of people are trying to reconcile that with the realities of what we're now seeing. The other theme that kept popping up was you could really feel, it's sort of like watching SNL. I don't know if any of you guys watch SNL, but I've been a lifelong viewer. And for the 3 or 4 years, starting in 2020, everything got very political and pointed, and you could see a lot of, hey, you need to be in this camp looking at things a certain way. And the lines between what was supposed to be entertainment and what was supposed to be an important message started getting blurrier. What I saw coming through in a lot of the messages where people were kind of saying, yeah, let's lower the temperature a little bit. And I've been glad to see that, not just as a citizen, but as a marketer in this space. I'm happy to see a lot of groups bringing forth personalities that are trying to have a good faith conversation without so much venom and without so much judgment, kind of making a little bit of a bigger tent, not just for their audience, but also for the brands that are supporting them, that are tired of getting caught in the crossfire. So the transition from that is the part that I got to participate in. Our partners with Seeker the brand safety and suitability company that's coming in hot on the audio space. They gave me a few minutes on stage. It was sort of like running into the room, and it was like, okay, you got 2 minutes, go. And so I really kind of ranted for probably 5 minutes or longer. I know I over exceeded my time, but I thought that there was an important message that the industry really needed to hear, and I'll just restate that briefly. We have a lot of over-reliance and false senses of security coming from a lot of the tools that we're using in brand safety and suitability. And I hold my hand up as somebody that's, helped be involved with bringing 4 of them to market in some way. There were a lot of assumptions made about what tech could do and the frameworks we should be using as we're grading media. This whole podcast started as the Media Roundtable, exploring this idea of how do you as a brand and as a marketer and as a content creator really help advance values that you can stand behind and in a way that's profitable. We've gone down some paths and are now making them industry standards that really aren't working very well. And so what I saw my role as is doing a bit of an intervention on the industry and just saying, let's say it out loud. It's not going that well. We've taken the GARM framework, Global Advertisers for Responsible Media. We took 11 categories, and we've asked brands to set their tolerance levels on 4 different risk profiles for each one, as though anybody in the universe really knows what those definitions actually mean as they translate them to their ad campaigns. Nobody really knows. No 2 people inside of an organization would ever come to the same conclusions if they were setting those tolerance levels. And so I think we're asking a lot of the wrong questions, and then we're relying on machines, AI and machine learning through these systems to apply those criteria to the shows that we listen to, running their transcripts through. And what's happening is you have a lot of false precision. So brands are sponsoring things they probably shouldn't or wouldn't intentionally, and they're not sponsoring things they probably should. And the error rate on this thing is insane, and nobody's looking at the transcripts. We have no accountability. There is no quality control in the audio space for brand safety and suitability to see how what has become the industry standard, what we hoped would work, is actually not working that well. And, the solution we're proposing is civility score as a primary metric, and using the machine learning and the GARM framework as a secondary metric to alert you when maybe you need to look a little closer at something, but not as something that you can set your tolerance levels, ignore, and hope that the programmatic robots are going to accurately interpret your company's values and make sure you stay out of harm's way. It's not working. We need to say it out loud. We need to repeat it. We need to find a suitable solution. We believe the civility score, because it measures personal attack, will cut out about 95% of the problem, keep brands from getting sucked into the culture wars, and allow you to advertise broadly so that you're not just afraid of being adjacent to topics, because topics aren't the problem. It's how the topics are treated, how responsibly those topics are treated. Brands need a tool to guide them through that. We believe the tech can do this by measuring personal attack accurately. Besides personal attack and swear words, these machines aren't that precise. So that was the big message that we came with. And I think it actually fit within a lot of the themes that we were hearing throughout the day from other people. So that's my recap. But I know that I'm not the only person on this panel that was at the event. So I don't know if Cassandra, you or James have anything you want to add about your experience throughout the day.
No, I mean, I think that covered it. That was sort of a recurrent theme for me as well. Watching all those sessions is just this appetite, right, to approach debate in a way that maybe it hasn't in the past. And at Wise, I mean, we have always wholeheartedly embraced that kind of conversation, so long as it's done in a respectful way and in a professional way. So, yeah, a lot of those themes I was so happy to hear. Maybe I should be a little upset now that more advertisers are going to access all the inventory that Wise was always buying, perhaps at a discount, because other brands would stay away. But no, I'm happy, and I think that will encourage additional investment in this space, which is good for all of us.
Amen.
Yeah, no question. James, what about you? Any point of view on this?
No, I mean, I think Dan definitely struck a chord with the attendees there. We did hear a lot of people chattering about the session in a good way afterwards, and a few people came up to me like, "Oh, you're Oxford Road. Your CEO spoke on that brand safety initiative. That was great." And so I think you really opened a lot of ears to consider different ways of looking at brand safety. So well done there. And just the general upfront too. I think it was a nice gathering of people in the industry, and it always amazes me how small the podcast industry is and how many people just kind of move around and they're at different companies now, but everyone's in the same general family. So it's always nice to go to those things and see people used to work with and catch up with them now to do bigger.
It's a high school, isn't it?
This was the middle school reunion, because I feel like podcast movement's like the high school or even college reunion.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
a
well,
small world.
One
And,
other thing I'll throw out there, and Stu, and then we'll let you take it to the topic at hand. But one of the other things that I thought was cool is every time I go to one of these things, somebody or some people come up and start talking about how they listen to the show. And I'm always so excited. I'm like, you're the listener. You're the one. I'm so glad to meet you in real life. But no, you actually see real people that are spending time listening to the Media Roundtable, and that, the challenges we're trying to address here are being heard, and they are being heard by people that work in this industry and have some influence in it. So always positive when you don't just create something like this and hope that somebody bumps into it, but you actually meet the people in real life. I got some unsolicited comments on that were all very positive too. So keep listening, and thank you for everybody's engagement here.
I'm happy to hear you met our listener. That's excellent. Let's give them a little more. Let's talk about the other big event that was going on in New York, the CAO Messaging Forum, and let's just get right into it. So, like I said, we talked about a few different aspects of messaging when it comes to audio and podcast and radio across the board. Big one, juicy one coming up for a lot of people. A lot of people talk about it, sonic branding. We all know the power of sonic branding is huge. It gives brands a chance to get recognized, even when their audience's eyes are closed. Or a friend of mine had said, I caught this in the last couple of weeks, like we can show them more than they can see. I thought that was a nice turn of a phrase by Jordan Brady. And sonic brand cues, the facts are sonic brand cues are 7 times better at recall and brand attribution than all other brand cues. So a mascot, a founder, a color, a logo, any one of them, that sonic brand cue is incredibly powerful. And this is really important because only 16% of brands, according to How Brands Grows, only 16% of ads are correctly attributed. So using a sonic brand to move that number up is seems like a no duh, but it's really, really hard apparently. So for you attendees of the CAO Messaging Forum, ideally, what should brands be doing right now with their sonic branding?
So I'll jump in here. So I can admit, actually, so Wise doesn't do this, I think, in a meaningful way currently. And there may be a lot of reasons for that. But just in the room, sort of the notes I was taking, most of the brands that were talking about doing this well or finding some success with this, it really seemed to be an integrated push across their brands. So, right, this wasn't just an element of an audio ad or a television ad. It's really something that was a core part of their brand identity, and you could see that, you could hear that, you could feel that across multiple different touch points. And so for me at Wise, that's always been, I would even say, maybe part of the struggle to talk about this more meaningfully. And that is that often, like my team and the teams that are hearing most about sonic branding, right, in the audio world, we're not necessarily the ones that are making that final decision. We're not really owning our brand and our brand identity. So it was just providing a lot of insight for me to sort of jot down some notes and go engage with, our broader creative brand team at Wise.
Absolutely. I think you're onto something, and it's had me thinking this idea of like equipping CAOs with a sonic branding audit first. Like, this is how you're showing up in audio. And then that's a story, because we've all got to tell stories. That's a story. Then you can start telling that story internally and back up, because like you're saying, it starts in a different place. And so it's difficult to get the ball rolling. But Nikhil, I know you had some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I think what really stood out is not a lot of brands have sonic branding, right? But there's real interest and intent in getting an understanding of what exactly is this and how to crack this. So step number one is, if you already have sonic branding, use it, right? That's the most important thing. Consistency is key. How do you use sonic branding across all the assets that you have, right? We live in an age where customers are omnipresent. They're everywhere. Your brand needs to be omnipresent. And sonic branding is part of that. So you have to make sure that you're using it consistently. That augments the entire outcome. And the other important thing over here is using sonic branding just for the sake of it is not going to get anyone the outcome. In my experience, it hasn't worked. You really have to be thoughtful in terms of how you are integrating your sonic branding in the rest of the message that you have. It's not like you just add a sound that you have as sonic branding at the beginning of the ad, in the middle of the ad, at the end of it, right? You really have to break down the ad asset to a level where you are recreating it while keeping in mind that you have to integrate the sonic branding as well. So I think that's two things in summary, right? Use it everywhere where you can. And second, be thoughtful about it, not just add it for the sake of it. Be really, really thoughtful in terms of how you can really integrate the sonic branding in the entire narrative or the message that you're trying to deliver to your audience.
I think you're spot on. I think of it in those three ways. It's like, be distinct, be intentional, and be consistent. Like,
Yeah.
absolutely. Oxford Road team, did you guys have thoughts on this one as well?
Yeah, one of my thoughts is that, in addition to everything everyone's saying, some of the brands have a sound that is already associated with them. Like, one of the brands has an app that dings when you have a correct answer. Like, that ding is synonymous with their brand, which could be a starting point, but that shouldn't be the end point. So somebody mentioned in the room that it takes patience and budget to make them effective. And someone else actually pointed out, which I've really liked, was that back in the 80s and the 90s, those are all where you have like the iconic jingles for brands or the iconic TV theme songs. There are no more. No one has a TV theme song anymore. And there's no like Family Matters, Full House type of Brady Bunch theme song anymore. And now it's just like, how quick can we get the name of the show in there so we can cram more ads in or more content in there? But that is something that audio is not really skippable in that regard, where it's just like you have a DVR can just go fast forward on. If you're listening to the radio, if you're listening to satellite radio, even people listening on podcasts and streaming, it takes some effort to pull it out of your phone, out of your pocket, or reach over while you're driving and move forward. So that's really where you can invest the time and effort to make something memorable, even more than just a mnemonic. It could be a jingle. I mean, without naming names, someone said there was a jingle from the 80s that they just brought back into their product mix now, which everyone knows and loves. So it has that millennial thought and feeling behind it.
I was going to say, I think that all of us in the room, I hope I'm not giving away any trade secrets here, but I think we saw the impact of that. Just an anecdote. Stu, you had a really clever icebreaker, right? Where folks were introducing themselves, but then they were also asked to sing, hum, whatever they felt brave enough to do, a piece of sonic branding that stuck in their brain. And I think all of us were just watching and listening to everyone in the room. And oh my goodness, these could have been from a decade ago. They could have been local. But when they hum or sung them, everyone kind of nodded in agreement. You could hear people say, "Ah, yeah, totally." So just that lasting power of when brands do get this right was so evident just by all the examples people shared.
Yeah, I mean, it's astounding. Audio is processed faster than any other sense. It lasts longer than visual. It's processed in the same part of the brain as memory and emotion, and all of that adds up to the things that you're talking about. Where, yeah, it's a fun game, and we had a lot of brave people. We had a lot of brave people that were singing their songs. Dan, what did you experience in the room?
Before I give you my thoughts on this, let me just back up for 1 second and provide context to anybody that's listening that doesn't know what we're talking about when we talk about Chief Audio Officer and our meeting or our event. last week. So Chief Audio Officer Club is kind of like Fight Club for marketers who invest in audio and are responsible for those results. Except that our rule is we will talk about Chief Audio Officer Club. In fact, we'll podcast about it. But the point is, like, there's another podcasting conference every other week somewhere, and you can go to a lot of them. You can learn a lot, and it's definitely good for relationship building and a lot of context, especially for beginners. But if you have dollars on the line or even your livelihood dependent on it, and you're a brand and you're trying to figure out how to use this kind of weird misshapen tool that is audio that could be your secret weapon, but you don't necessarily know all the best practices on how to unlock it, we figured, what if we just got a lot of those brands in a room, sitting around a table and talking in very practical terms about how they solve these problems? And so we do a number of events throughout the year. And this was a forum that makes it a smaller group. So we'll have, 20 to 25 people included. And we have a guided discussion around a theme. And this particular forum was all about creative. So, well, what I experienced in the room was, I think, common when this subject comes up, which is there's always interest. I think that, there's not a lot of skepticism around the benefits and the research behind it. But I think that what happens is we all get a little paralyzed with this one because it's so intimate. It's so subjective. There's so many different places to start. It's sort of like naming your company or naming a child. It's just like, except, you do that with words that you're accustomed to using. Now you're trying to create music, and very few of us have ever composed music. And you're like, well, I don't even know how to start in this process. Setting aside the fact that you'd need approvals up the management chain, and you have to get stakeholders to buy in and to agree on a brief and to agree on a budget. There's a lot of psychological and practical hurdles that people have to go through. And I can just tell you, like, for everybody that listens to this podcast, we've been doing it for years. We've been running the same music for years. Everybody hated it. I got complaints from everyone who listened, and I wanted to change it, but didn't really know where to start. And we went through a whole process of vetting list after list. And we're just talking about music that you can change out anytime. We're not even putting paid media dollars against this. And, and I get to approve anything I want. So even still, the analysis paralysis that can kick in with this thing is really intimidating. And it reminds me of a lot of projects we've worked on in the past in TV, where it's like, you don't really get a lot of corporate interest at the executive level on audio copy most of the time, unless something goes wrong. But if you're doing a TV spot, I've seen brands rent out a movie theater to show their staff the new brand ad that they were going to put on television, right? And it's one of those highly sensitive things. And I think sometimes to kind of bypass all that, the important part is to create something that is good enough and test it, right? It's how do you, figure out what is the kind of MVP of approvals that you can go through? How do you not get too ambitious at the start to say, now I agree with the point that I think everybody's been making. You should have a consistent sound. You should be able to recognize your brand with your eyes closed. But the process of, if you're a CAO trying to get that off the ground, that's a daunting task. So rather than just making it so overwhelming and intimidating, do a proof of concept, put it in market, test it against ads that don't have it, and see if you're seeing your recall increase, see if you're seeing your performance increase, and kind of de-escalate a little bit so you can get started. And then if it doesn't feel right over time, you can change it. I think the hard thing is just going from 0 to 1 before you go 1 to 10. And I think that's where most of these things die. So I really felt like that was a kind of a key theme throughout the conversation.
Okay, pop quiz. Have you ever heard of these companies? Shopify, Bayer, Oracle, Indeed, Masterclass, Babbel, Tommy John. We could go on. I don't just host the Media Roundtable podcast, but I have the good fortune of being the CEO of a company called Oxford Road, where we are the world's leading independently owned and operated agency specializing in audio. Think podcasts, radio, and streaming. And what that means is that we get to help great companies, companies worth fighting for, grow with audio advertising, whether it's podcasts, radio, or streaming, and all its various tentacles. This includes media planning and buying. We do analytics, attribution, and insights. We also have a special way that we deal with creative and copy generation. It's our own proprietary process called audiolytics that allows us to score ads for their persuasiveness. Bottom line is we don't just work here. Audio is our passion, and we want to lead this industry to new heights beyond what we've ever seen so far. That's why we've been leading the industry in brand safety and suitability and actually bringing you solutions to market so that you can evaluate the way that you get placed in a show so that it matches up with your values, in addition to avoiding the things that you know might be problematic for your brand. If you're a chief audio officer and you're looking to get best in market performance at maximum viable scale, do get in touch with us at oxfordroad.com. Or if you love audio and are strategic, relentless, and looking for a career change, consider joining our mission as a fellow agent of influence. Just flip us your resume through oxfordroad.com. And if you're working anywhere in the audio industry and you're serious about this business, make sure you go to oxfordroad.com, easy to spell. Sign up for our free newsletter, The Influencer, at oxfordroad.com. And make sure you mention that you heard about us on the Media Roundtable podcast.
Absolutely, and we'll move on to the next one. You know, one of the things we equipped the CAOs with was a starter sonic branding brief. That really, there's two key things when I think of it to identify, and it's what is the business problem that you're solving, and how do you want people to feel, and you know, that's the way the conversation can start for sure, because all the best logos that we can think of are the ones that come most readily to mind: Netflix, Intel Inside, McDonald's, to name three. When you really dig into it, they'd identified the business or functional issue they were solving, and they were very intentional in how they put it together. So it can definitely be done, and I'm glad we were able to have that conversation. So the next piece that we discussed was message design, and when it comes to marketers' perception versus reality, thanks to Pierre Bouvard's work over the years in putting these studies together, again and again, it's revealed that marketers perceive that creative's impact is about 20%, when in actuality, its impact on sales, on incremental sales, is 49%. So the biggest lever for performance really is creative, and the biggest lever for creative is the messaging. How do you put that message together? But when it comes to audio messaging, there's many forks in the road. You know, are you doing host, read, or produced? Are you doing streaming or podcast? Are you doing radio or smart speaker? And how do you design the right audio only message for the medium and the audience? There's a lot to dig in there. But for our CAOs that are joining us today, what are some of the key elements of successful audio only message design to you guys?
Yeah, I think it's similar to any other platform that you think of, right? When you talk about key elements in the message, clarity. The message needs to have clarity, right? It should be easy and simple for you to communicate your message and for the audience to be able to relate to it and resonate with it. Engagement. Is your messaging engaging, right? You're able to communicate, but if it's not engaging enough, no one is going to pay attention and defeats the entire purpose. The emotion as well, very, very important, according to me. Does your message invoke any emotion in your audience? Are you able to build any emotion in your audience through that 15-second, 30-second, 60-second creative that you have? Call to action, pretty straightforward. You are running an ad for to get a particular outcome. So call to action is really, really important. And then just the relevance of it. Is this the right set of audience? Because the messaging can be awesome, can be amazing, but if it's not the right set of audience, it's not going to resonate. The other way is also true. So I think the elements, according to me, they are pretty much similar across be it like audio creative or visual creative, or are you running an ad on Facebook or TikTok or Instagram, anything. It's clarity, engagement, emotion, your call to action, and then relevance with the audience.
I think those are solid things to make sure that you're nailing, and in audio you can have a clear picture of what that audience is, and we've seen success in like what's the right level of customization when it comes to audio. What about you, Cassandra?
Yeah, I will double click on a lot of the things that have already been mentioned, but I'll reiterate. I think clarity and actually conciseness and brevity. I think maybe Wise is one of the only advertisers that sometimes says we don't actually want the full 60 seconds. We feel like we can accomplish what we need to say in 40. But I think when we are working with our copywriters here, always try to remember let's write the ad that we'd want to hear on our favorite podcast. And some of that is still aspirational, right? We're working on getting this right. But I do think that there's a certain level of just coming to terms with reality that all of us should make sure is reflected when we're helping to craft these ads. We're all podcast listeners. We're all podcast lovers. We know the state of mind we're in when we're listening. We know how much of our attention probably ends up getting focused on those advertisements. And I think being honest about that actually helps us as marketers craft ads that are digestible for the format. So I think that's another thing that is key. We've talked a lot about like how to customize, to what level is that necessary. And I think just some customization for the medium is probably one of the most effective things that marketers could do when they're crafting creative in this space.
Yeah, I think about that too, because it's like, media, this is really about human behavior. And you think about, like, I was just listening to Sounds Profitable this morning, and when it comes to a podcast listener's behavior, for much of it is around curiosity and learning. So just thinking about that and how we're crafting this message to put it in front of somebody that's doing something that's on demand, that's in that mindset, that is naturally going to impact the way that you craft the message. James, I know you had some thoughts on this too.
Yeah, I echo everything that was just said too, and what I don't know if I was shocked, but it was a little jarring to hear a lot of the consistency from a lot of the different chief audio officers in the room, was that some of them tried to just take the script from their TV and it didn't work. Some of them tried to just take the full audio from the TV and it didn't work. Some of them tried to write it because they think, oh, this shouldn't be hard. They wrote it themselves and it didn't work. And the consistent message was, when it didn't work, they all turned to somebody who knew audio and was experts in audio to write the scripts, and then it worked. Whether that was their agencies, whether that was letting the podcast hosts write it on their own, whether it was letting the radio networks help them with it, but it was leaning on the experts to do it. Because I think it's very easy to say, oh, it's just what they hear, so let's just use the TV spot and the audio from there. And it's very, very good to hear that everyone kind of came around to it, but I think there's probably plenty of brands out there who are still trying that and maybe a little resistant to let others in to help them.
For sure, for sure. And I think something else I think of with this, again, kind of going back to Nikhil's point on relevance, I also think of relevance to the funnel. So what's the problem that we're solving? Is it awareness, consideration, preference, or purchase? And there's different audio media that are better at that than others. I think you can, use them however you choose. It's your strategy you're deploying. But, are we doing awareness with a broadcast radio campaign, or are we zooming in and we're trying to get that preference and purchase? So let's let these hosts ad lib longer. Like, be thinking, what is that problem? First kind of principles. What's the problem we're trying to solve? Where are we trying to hit them in the funnel? And that's going to impact which type of audio we choose and then how we show up in that audio. Dan, did you have anything you wanted to add on this subject before we move on?
Sure. I mean, I'm an advocate for formulas. I mean, I got the trademark on Audiolytics in, I think, 2009. And, what started as kind of a just very simple checklist, I think under your stewardship, Stu, has, evolved to 9 key components, 71 subcomponents, and a whole metric system for it. So As a card-carrying ENTJ Myers-Briggs, I'm big on the formulas and like having a method, right? And but then how do you apply that, and does it apply everywhere? I think that's where we get a lot of debate. There was not a lot of debate in the room full of marketers about whether or not there needs to be a formula. And I think that like that the argument against like, oh, it kills the creativity, like I think that dies as soon as you are responsible for results, and B, when you realize that every type of scripted entertainment you've ever seen also follows a formula, right? So our art is not higher than the art that you pay for to be art. And so formulas are important, but how you use them is really important. And, you know, like we were talking about ad length, I thought it was interesting. I've been in the more you tell, the more you sell camp most of my career, but with pixel tracking, specifically on audio, we no longer necessarily have to repeat a call to action 14 times to get people to remember it, right? And so that actually frees up a little bit of space. In fact, there are some brands that use it other than to get you to respond right now. So if you may need a longer ad, or you may need to be a lot more precise about your call to action about, are you using an offer? Is there scarcity associated with that offer? What is the path that you're asking them to go down, and how much do you have to repeat it? Like even those components, I think, shift depending on what the campaign objective is. And if you're trying to create top of mind awareness, you do not need to do that. In fact, maybe all you need is that Sonic logo. But if you need to see results today, and you need people to, you know, make sure they also give the channel credit for where they came from, like a lot of us are having to deal with, well, you're going to have to be a little more deliberate and make sure your formula illuminates those aspects of the campaign. And so the other thing I would say is, like, you know, just think about conversion rate. Since we're talking about funnel, if you've got a product that requires high trust, right, you need substantiation. You need the reasons to believe, credibility builders, whatever language you want to use for that. But it will correlate to the conversion rate, because you may do something that's really interesting. You may write a great headline and drive intrigue, and people might go check you out, but that doesn't mean they're going to give you money. And so sometimes what you have to do in the ad, and then hopefully pay it off through the session experience, when they go where you ask them to go, is helping them feel confident that this is the right decision, and it's the right decision for you right now. These are all things that can get sorted out with a formula, but the kind of the art of it is figuring out how hard you need to push which buttons depending on the actual campaign objectives. So, I mean, look, we could do a series on formulas and, you know, pros and cons and approaches, but yeah, I saw a lot of consensus in the room. And I do think that there's always an it depends factor. And I think looking at what the objectives are for how you're measuring success in the campaign really has to tie to how you're leveraging the formula you've chosen to use.
Yeah, how are we measuring success, and how long do we have to get there? And you talking about formulas and getting people to take action, the real magic and weirdness of podcasts is that it's so collaborative. We rely on these real hosts to make the introduction of our brands, and they can make or break a campaign based on how well they deliver the message and make it their own, or don't make it their own. And referring to the audiolytics formula, 71 subcomponents that are either present or not present. One of the subcomponents that has the highest weighting based on performance data is a host endorsement. Both a host reading an ad, and then also a host giving that personal endorsement. But before we dig into that, Nikhil, yes, you had something else you wanted to add on the topic of messaging and formulas.
Yeah, this entire conversation just like came to me all of a sudden. It's like you guys took me back a couple of days when we had this event in person. And the discussion around formulas, right? Dan, that you mentioned, like it's not a question anymore whether a formula exists or not. It's just about whether you're ready to accept it or not. Formulas exist, right? But the other part of the discussion that was happening is around similar to what you mentioned, do formulas kill creativity? I think the key over here, and I was thinking about this conversation after that event, for having a formula doesn't make or break your creative. How do you utilize that formula to create a compelling narrative makes or breaks the creative or the messaging. So the narrative is very, very important over here. And I think a lot of the times when, from a company standpoint, when we think about formulas, what I've seen with my teams when they're not successful with audio advertising is them using the formula to create a message that's literally just, you have a hook, you have the product, you have the CTA, you share that with the host and you ask them to just narrate it, right? There's no narrative behind it. It's just someone's just reading 3 sentences. That's like, one is categorized as a hook, the message, the body of it, and the call to action. So I think that's also very, very important in terms of how do you create that narrative using that formula, and how do you keep that consistent is something of importance over here.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Like we talked about, it's like when it's used well, it disappears. So if you can still see it, it's not, you can still see the strings on the puppet. Then it's
Right.
like, this isn't good. And it's like going back to what's the problem that I'm solving? How well do I understand the audience, their emotion? That is where all the emotional stuff comes in to go, then what is that insight that we have? How could we say something with the language they use, or maybe say something that once we've said it, they're like, that's exactly what I would say, tying it in with a story and then bring it to life with the formula in such a way that the formula ceases to exist. But like you're saying, the tail can wag the dog and you can get some really dry, uninspired stuff, but they can go, but I checked all the boxes.
Right.
Okay. So hosts can also do that. I read the copy. I checked all the boxes. What's your problem? You didn't bring it. You didn't bring it to life. And if I had $1 for every time I had a marketer say, you can hear it, you can hear it, you can hear the difference when they believe it. I have questions about that. Nevertheless, I think they can hear it. They're feeling something. But for you guys, are there masters of reads for your brands that you've worked with? And what did they do so well? Or just when you think of the best reads for your brands or brands you've worked on, you know, who are the best and what is it that they do so well? And Cassandra, I'll start with you.
Yeah. So in my experience, I think the secret ingredient to getting the host read that we all want, so us as advertisers and also that host and their audience, actually has to do with what happens before that ad read ever gets created. And it goes beyond just like a simple like intro call. Those are great. I think that's where, you know, hosts and advertisers and teams get on the same page. But the focus of that call is what I've found to make the difference. And when we have a host who has the time and even the team structure to not only spend time talking to us about, you know, what are you hoping to get out of this read? Tell me a little bit about your brand, where we actually can dig into like, well, what are we trying to accomplish with this ad campaign? And we can talk to them as business people, right? And so we can tell them more about, you know, what primary metric are we looking to move? How do we typically think about success? Obviously, this falls outside the scope sometimes of, you know, the magic that they're creating for us. But when they are interested and they feel like they want to authentically ask about those things, I find it just all kind of puts us on the same team. And it's like with anyone, right? If you're looking to get a certain outcome, if you help explain to them where you're coming from, why, how are you thinking about this behind the scenes? Like, again, it's just psychology. People are way more willing to give you the end result you want if they understand where you're coming from. And so I found that to be true here too. So some of the best ad reads that we've had delivered just come from someone who took the time and had the time to ask us about what we were looking to achieve.
So you're saying hosts are people too.
It's crazy.
It turns out they're people. Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes what I do, I didn't do it at this one, but I like handing people a packet, like a 6-page packet. And I'm like, okay, now do a read. We're talking about doing an ad read competition at the next podcast movement, because it's like, yes, hopefully you've had that call, but sometimes, you know, it's like all you're presented with is all these words. It's like, how do I make heads or tails of this? What I was thinking of with that, the point I'm trying to make is this, is that in lieu of that, if you can't do that, that makes even more of a case to really sharpen your copy so that it's already there. It's already in that emotional space, even that they can get right into it and go for it. Right. But best case, Cassandra, like you're saying, is that you get the buy-in, you have the conversations, you make it inefficient, like no question, but you got to have copy that can work if you don't do that. So you've done the hard work. So then it's effortless. Nikhil, for you, at the brands you've worked on, your campaigns, where do you see the magic happen?
Yeah, I think with the brands that I've worked for, it's never been a requirement for the host to try the product first. It's always a good to have thing. This was one of the things that really stood out to me in that entire forum as well, where there was this one mattress company where they're like, it's compulsion for us. We only work with podcasters who have either used our product, or if they have not, they're willing, they're in the market for a new mattress. We send it to them, they try it out first, and then only then they qualify for running an ad for our brand, right? So to the broader question over here, that just logically makes sense to me, right? Because now all of a sudden, you're not just giving me a script to read it out, you're asking me about my own personal experience, where a lot of the things that we already discussed about, right? Like emotions being attached, there's being some particular outcomes that we were looking for, that just comes naturally. And when that happens, as a listener, you can feel the difference when a podcaster is, or when a host is just reading out a message that's been delivered by the brand versus they having used that particular product themselves and then vouching for it, becoming an advocate. Even if they're not calling themselves an advocate, it just there's a difference that you can hear that makes the entire outcome exponentially better for the brand. So I think that's one thing over here, which is like, can you make your product trial worthy for the podcaster? That's one. Or can you find the hosts who are willing to use your product, invest time and energy, and then do the advertisement for you?
Yeah, and we've gotten to this place where we go, it never hurts. It never hurts to get that, because there's these exceptions to the rule where there's very dry reads that work really well, and so hopefully your message is dialed, but for whatever reason, sometimes when you stack everything up against each other, there's these reads that are very like this, but they still perform. To me, that's the exception that proves the rule. It's like you need to be digging for the personal endorsement and that the stuff, everything that we were talking about right now. We've got to keep moving. This is great. This is how CAO messaging events go. This is how all CAO events go. So anybody that's listening, our listener, if they haven't attended a CAO messaging forum yet, it is time, because it is always such a great conversation. So just like last week, it's kind of happening on this episode. The bonus round that came up was A/B testing, and it ended up being a juicy one. And we all know the value of A/B testing, but when it comes to audio, that's difficult. Cassandra, I wanted to get your point of view on testing and audio, and how you've been able to make it successful, and how you even determine what to test, and then how you're able to approach testing in audio.
Yeah, so this is something we talk a lot about. And I think the way that Wise approaches buying audio has us uniquely positioned to do this, maybe in a way that other brands maybe sometimes struggle if they're only buying host reads. So we tend to buy a lot of dynamically inserted ads. We tend to work with publishers who offer scale. So I think there's just a few key components of how we buy audio already that sort of sets a nice testing ground for creative messaging. That said, although we do feel like I think we found, a structure, just using even third-party attribution tracking, right, to help do some very, very basic A/B copy tests. So you have the same show running for the same amount of time. You can evenly split out impressions, just really trying to control to make sure you get a clean read on what comes out if you're testing two different copy sets against each other. I think the good thing is we've confirmed, yes, the mechanism is there, the structure is there. Now, scaling that and actually producing meaningful results, that's been a little bit more challenging. So I think we've taken away some learnings. I think we are still trying to figure out how to do this at scale. That's sort of the next phase of this at Wise. But I think just some takeaways that we found are, when you're testing creative messaging, you have to make sure that you have distinct messages to test, right? In our experience, it hasn't been very effective to say, you know what, we want to see how this two-word change in the CTA performs against, these other two words in another version. That we just have never been able to get an accurate or a reliable read on. In fact, we always look at conversion rates, and they're near identical. So I think we, there's just a formula there too that you have to get right to achieve significance when testing copy. So we're working on it, but I think it's doable.
I think it is too, and it's more doable now than it ever was, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Ad tech is advancing. Our understanding, like I said, of what we need to run effective creative messaging tests. So I imagine lots of brands will be exploring this like we are.
And Dan, I know we've hit our heads on this for over a decade now and longer, counting the early days. How do you think of this? How do you think of A/B testing in audio?
With weeping and gnashing of teeth.
Yeah, I was gonna say I was gonna invite the trauma, and you brought it. I knew that's
it's easy to find. So no, the when I think about it, I mean, one thing that everybody I think said in the room is like, don't bunt, take big swings, right? And that is, I think, one key ingredient when A/B testing is that you're not just trying to go for like a 2 percentage point different, because what's going to happen is you're going to question the results. Stuff is hard to isolate. And what you don't want is to leave your test with a question mark that is inconclusive. And the biggest struggle we have had in the last decade at this agency, and really my whole career, it's vexed us, is you try to be diligent, you try to control all the variables, and you get to the end of it and you go, yeah, I'm not really sure because this and that weren't exactly as clean as we intended. Or it just didn't move the needle enough, or it worked over here and then it didn't work over there. And so I think, being really precise and limiting your variables and making sure that those variables are as large as you can do. The biggest variables are things like offers, things that a consumer is, if you tell somebody, hey, I really have a great pair of socks that I want you to buy, and you should go check them out, but you're running a campaign that's 30 days long, and you're going to decide if you're going to keep advertising on that channel based on the results of that test. The audience doesn't know they only have 30 days to respond. They think that you're just building awareness. So if you say, hey, I'm actually so confident these are the best socks you're ever going to wear that I'm willing to give you your first pair free, and if you pay for the second pair, and I'm willing to do that if you respond by Sunday at midnight of this week. Like, that's, people do stuff when you give them deadlines. You know that from telling people, sending reminder emails to people on your team. Deadlines matter. Carrots and sticks matter. You're going to take it away. You're going to give them something extra if they respond by a deadline. So like, that's a big swing. Or, if you're not sure which way to position the product, do you position it against your competitive set, or do you compare it against inactivity and not going for a solution at all? What is the most consequential thing that you could test? That's I think, the first question, and then tightly controlling your parameters on how you do that. Recently we've been doing tests on things like unit length, sonic logos within the context of host reads, which was kind of interesting. I didn't even know we were working on that until I found out about it, but it sounds like there's been a real unlock that can drive a meaningful result. How much do you customize by show or by genre? All these things can unlock real differences in performance. And it's not that easy if you're working with the right people, and you've put in a really solid buy, to go and cut 40% off of your spot rate, your unit rate when you're buying media. If you're worth your salt, but if you if you do test and you do, one thing at a time, you have look, we're not going to do multivariate testing in audio anytime soon. We can talk about it. We can dream. We're not there yet, but if you can keep it simple and go one big swing at a time, kind of working your way down the weighting, you could get a 40% improvement in performance on every media dollar you spend. So it's like some of the most important work that you can do. And I'm glad we're talking about it, and I'm glad we're talking about how to measure it, because if you can't measure it, what are we doing? So hopefully that's helpful.
We're hitting our head against the wall. It's very helpful. It's incredibly helpful. I want to hear from James, because he's on the front lines with so many accounts. But before I do, Nikhil, actually, I want to jump to you in case you got to get out of here. So Nikhil, what do you think about when you think about all this and hearing what Cassandra and Dan have said?
Yeah, there's a lot, like double click on everything that has been mentioned over here, fully aligned. There's a lot of things that can be A/B tested, right? In the streaming space or in any other space. The kind of podcast, the genres that you're in, what kind of host you work with, male voice versus female voice, whether it's what kind of topics they cover. Is it evergreen topic, topical stuff? What setup is it? Is it just is it interview style? Is it just the host saying for the entire 15-20 minutes of the podcast length, 1 hour, whatever that is? So assuming that you have decided on the media, you know what your media, you've nailed down your media buying over here for streaming audio, let's say, you know exactly who you want to work with, the genres, all of that stuff. I think I want to double click on what Cassandra mentioned over here around the messaging being significantly different, right? And to Dan's point as well, anytime you do any kind of test, the goal should be to get a binary outcome. The binary outcome is whether it worked or it did not work. And that can only happen when you see a significant delta compared to the control, right? A 2% increase, a 3% increase can be noise in the grand scheme of things. You really want to test out something significantly, radically different to get a different outcome, right? The way that I think about testing messages that's going to be radically different or significantly different than what we are already doing is with a fundamental understanding that different users can use the same product to get either the same outcome or different outcome. This is very important, right? Why I say that is, again, this is something that I highlighted during the CAO event. I'll give an example of my current company. We don't run any streaming audio ads yet, but if we ever do, the way to think about this is going to be Albert. In short, it's a all-in-one app that helps you save, invest, and bank, right? The same app can be used by two different people for two different outcomes. How? And this goes back to the original conversation that we've been doing, where the purpose of the ad is also equally important. If your purpose of the ad is to convert people who are in market looking for a solution and you just want to introduce yourself as a potential option, sure, that's one way to go ahead with it, right? So if someone is looking for budgeting related stuff, for instance, it's easy. I don't have to educate them. It's just that I have to introduce myself and be like, hey, Albert is an option for budgeting. They'll download it. We'll get the customer. They'll get the outcome that they're looking for. Great. On the other hand, a radically different message over here is to talk to someone and make it more aspirational, where they're like, here's how successful people who are financially literate have been able to successfully save, I'm going to make this up, $1 million by the age of 35, for instance, right? And one of the prerequisites to do that is simple. You need to know how much you make and how much you spend, and you need a budgeting app for that. Albert is a solution, right? So I'm not introducing Albert as a solution that they're directly looking for. I'm tapping into the aspiration that they're looking into, which is like, even I would like to save $1 million by the age of 35. One of the prerequisites is this, and this is coming from someone who's already potentially done this. I would like to try it out. So it's the same product that you're selling. It's the same functionality that you're selling, but it's for a completely different audience set because the message is very different over here. One, you're going direct, introducing for a problem that they are facing and you're a solution. And the other is, you're just being aspirational in terms of what you can get in terms of the outcome for that potential audience set.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. I mean, it's don't bunt, right? So you could go in your example, you can go general with it, as general and broad and aspirational and emotional as possible. Go for it.
Yeah.
And then do one that's narrow, features, benefits, product. Like now we're talking, and James, I know you see a lot of this. We're kind of in extra innings here, but I really want to get your point of view when it comes to A/B testing, both in the narrow sense of like a very structured test, and then also in a more general way of sometimes a client just being willing to make a big change and in a sense do their A/B test live, doing it live. What are you seeing these days?
Yeah, we're actually piloting a new initiative, minimal live read copy. And we're trying to we heard all the hosts. We've been talking to networks who said, it's tough when you give us a whole script and there's all these lines, we can't really get creative and we're just reading what you guys put out there. So we came up with this initiative and we're working with one of our clients right now to test it out. It's literally 2 questions. It's what are your thoughts on the product and how is it different than competitors? And we're waiting to see what those results are. That just went out last week. It will be its own A/B test to see what difference it is between a very prescribed, talk about attributes, let's talk about all the different buzzwords that we can fit in there, or let's just flow and let's see what happens here. And what's funny is I was covering for someone last week and I was sending out some copy and some of the networks actually said, yeah, but we need some bullet points. I'm like, no, but that's the whole point. You don't need bullet, just tell your whole story. That's the whole spot. And they kept saying, yeah, but we need some guidance on it. So it's kind of funny to see everyone asking for flexibility and you give them the ultimate flexibility and they still want the same guardrails. But again, let's see how it all works out. So stay tuned here to hear some results, hopefully in the near future.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. And it is exactly what we've heard from hosts many times. Like, hey, I'm telling you, if you just give me the CTA and you give me freedom, just let me do my thing. We're like, got a client that's willing to do that. Let's go for it. Let's see what happens. It's a big swing. Well, this was awesome. Never enough time. Very exciting and great to get your guys' points of view. So let's just recap. This is what I'm getting. Sonic branding benefits from consistency. It helps recall, and you probably have at least one Sonic asset you can already use. Effective messaging needs to be designed for audio only, and Audiolytics is where you need to start. And you can check out our podcast solely dedicated to audio advertisements ad infinitum to hear more about how that comes to life. And we always got to remember that hosts are people too. So we want to leverage their unique connection to your brand and keep the conversation collaborative, like Cassandra was very much emphasizing on how important that is. And don't rest on your creative laurels. Always be testing, preferably branches, not twigs, like Nikhil is saying. Like, go for it. You got to make a significant difference so you don't just have that 2 to 3% of noise, but you can actually see something meaningful. So thank you all for joining the Media Roundtable. This podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road, where we want you to succeed in audio. We do, and to use influence for good. As members of the marketing community, we have the power to advance voices that don't just entertain, but edify, to build bridges across differences and preserve fair-minded discussion around the most important topics of our age. If you're a marketer looking to align your brand values with extraordinary business outcomes, reach out to our agency, Oxford Road, by visiting oxfordroad.com and subscribing to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. If you have any feedback or suggestions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at info@mediaroundtable.com. And a little plug for Ad Infinitum. Like I said, Ad Infinitum is Oxford Road's audio creative focused podcast. It's hosted by yours truly, Stu Redwine, VP Creative Services. And I recommend you start at episode 1 to get a better understanding of Audiolytics. And then we've got a ton of great guests as well. Season 2 is well underway. So be sure to check that out wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you to our guests, Cassandra and Nikhil. Thank you guys so much for coming on the show. And thank you for coming to the event last week.
Such a pleasure.
Yeah, pleasure.
And thank you to Bianca, Kyle, Haley, Ezra, Mary Jane, Everett, Neil, and the team at Podcast One. And thank you to James and Dan for joining today as well. And as always, our dear listener, influence responsibly.